July 14th, 1899. A French colonel rides across the dry grasslands of Niger with only a small escort. His name is Colonel Klobb. He has chased a rogue French army for more than 2,000 kilometers. In his pocket, he carries orders from Paris to arrest its commanders. He believes no French soldier would ever dare fire on a superior officer. He is wrong. The men he came to arrest are waiting for him in the scrub. Their commander gives the order. Rifles crack across the grass. Klobb falls dead in the dust, killed by soldiers marching under the same flag he served his whole life. And within 3 days, the officers who ordered his death will be dead too, shot down by their own troops. France spent the next 100 years trying to forget how this happened, but to understand how a French army destroyed itself in the heart of Africa, you have to go back 3 months earlier. You have to travel to a small fortress town called Lougou, and you have to meet the woman its soldiers were afraid to name after dark. Her name was Sarraounia. How does a queen armed with bows and arrows stand against an empire armed with rifles and a cannon? How does she hurt that empire so badly that its own soldiers begin to whisper that she cursed them? And why was her story kept out of the school books for a century? That is the story you are about to hear. It begins south of the Sahara, in the dry lands of what is now the country of Niger. Between the desert in the north and the great rivers in the south stood a small territory called Lougou. It was the home of a people called the Azna, a branch of the great Hausa world. They were farmers, hunters, and keepers of shrines, and by the end of the 1800s, they were almost alone. All around them, the world was changing. Old empires were falling. New faiths were spreading across the region, carried by preachers, traders, and conquerors. Powerful neighbors pressed in from every side, and slave raiders swept the countryside on horseback, feeding the markets of kingdoms far away. Most small communities did what they had to do to survive. They bowed, they paid, they converted. The Azna refused. While the lands around them changed religion and changed masters, they kept the old spirits and the old ways. Their shrines stayed open. Their festivals were still danced. Travelers spoke of Lougou as a place of powerful magic, where the spirits still answered and the priests still knew the ancient secrets. Some said it with respect, others said it with fear, and the Azna did something else that made them different from almost everyone around them. Generation after generation, they were not led by a king, they were led by a woman. Her title was Sarraounia. In the Hausa language, the word means queen, but among the Azna, it meant far more. The Sarraounia was ruler and high priestess in one body, the commander of warriors and the guardian of spirits at the same time. Think about how unusual that was. In an age when empires on every continent were built and ruled by men, this small nation trusted its survival, year after year, to a line of women. The men around her led the charges. The woman on the throne decided when and where and against whom. For the Azna, this was simply how the world worked. For their enemies, it was one more strange thing about Lougou. The Sarraounia's power rested on the spirits. She kept the great shrines, led the ceremonies that called the rains, and stood between her people and the unseen world. When neighbors fell sick, when harvests failed, when questions had no answers, people came to Lougou, sometimes from far beyond Azna lands. Even those who had taken new faiths quietly respected the old priestess queens. That respect would soon matter on the battlefield. Traditions differ about the girl who would carry that title into legend. Some accounts say her mother died giving birth to her. They say a warrior named Dawa, a friend of her father, took the orphan in and raised her as he would raise a son, against every custom of the land. He put a bow in her hands before she was tall enough to see over the grass. Those same traditions say her education was unlike anything given to other girls. She learned to ride and to fight. She learned the paths of the deep bush, where to find water in the dry season, which thorn thickets could hide 100 fighters. She learned the plants that heal wounds and the plants that stop a heart. By the time she was grown, the elders say, she could outshoot the best archers in the land. We cannot check every detail of those stories. They come from oral tradition and from the novel that later carried her name. But historians agree on the woman they describe. Sarraounia Mangou, queen of the Azna, was real. She was known for her skill with the bow and her mastery of herbal medicine, and long before any European reached her land, her name already made her neighbors nervous. Her reputation was not built on words. It was built on battles. When Tuareg raiders rode down from the desert to take slaves and cattle, Sarraounia's archers met them and drove them back into the sand. When powerful neighbors demanded that her people abandon their religion and accept new masters, she refused and made the refusal stick. Lougou held out like a stone in a rising river. Her enemies needed a way to explain their defeats, and they found one. They said the queen of Lougou was a sorceress. They said her arrows were guided by spirits, that her medicine could not be resisted, that she spoke with powers older than any empire. The rumors were meant as an insult. Sarraounia understood something her enemies did not. Fear is a weapon, and they had just handed it to her. And the peoples around Lougou noticed. A small nation that should have been swallowed long ago kept standing, year after year, under a woman's command. Some said it was her strategy. Some said it was her spirits. Most said it was both, and kept a respectful distance. In a region where power was measured in horsemen and muskets, Sarraounia had built something rarer, a reputation that did her fighting before her archers ever drew. For years, that was enough. The raids came, the raids were beaten, and life went on. But far away, in offices in Paris, men who had never seen the Sahel were drawing lines on a map of Africa. And one of those lines ran straight through her homeland. The real danger was still ahead, and it would not come on camelback. By the 1890s, the European powers were racing each other to claim every corner of Africa. France had built territories in the west and held claims in the center of the continent. Now it wanted to join them into one unbroken band of French land, from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Chad and beyond. On paper in Paris, it looked simple. A few lines, a few signatures, a few expeditions. There was a reason for the hurry. Britain, Germany, and other rivals were grabbing territory in the same years, and every month of delay meant another flag planted on land France wanted. In that race, speed was rewarded, and questions were not. Paris wanted results from Africa, not reports about methods. The men who delivered new territory became heroes. Nobody looked too closely at how they delivered it. So France launched 3 military missions at once, from 3 different directions. One came south across the Sahara from Algeria, one came north from the Congo, and one, the strongest and most dangerous, was to march east from the Niger River and cut through the heart of the Sahel. Its official name was the Central African Mission. History remembers it by the names of its 2 commanders. Captain Paul Voulet was 33 years old. Captain Voulet-Chanoine was 29. They had made their names 3 years earlier, in 1896, when they conquered the Mossi Kingdom and took the city of Ouagadougou for France. The newspapers in Paris printed polished stories about their brilliance. The people who lived along their route from that campaign told very different stories, about burned villages and mass killings. Nobody in Paris was listening to them. These men were also protected in ways ordinary officers were not. Chanoine's father was a powerful general who served for a time as the French Minister of War. His son marched with the confidence of a man who knew that whatever he did in Africa, powerful people at home would look away. It is a dangerous thing to give such men an army and send them beyond the reach of the law. The force they assembled was enormous for that region. Hundreds of trained African riflemen under French officers, cavalry on horseback, and a field cannon. Behind the fighting, men walked a second army of porters, servants, and captured women. Some accounts count around 1,300 people in the column. Others count nearly 3,000. It moved across the land like a city on the march, and like a city, it had to be fed. Here is the detail that explains everything that follows. The column could only carry supplies for about 30 days. After that, it was expected to live off the land, which is a polite way of saying it would take whatever it needed from the villages in its path. An army that feeds itself from other people's fields is an army at war with everyone it meets. In November 1898, the expedition left Dakar and marched east into the interior. And almost immediately, it began to burn. Villages that offered food were stripped of everything they had. Villages that hesitated were destroyed as a lesson to the next ones. People who ran were hunted through the bush. People who stayed were taken as porters or taken as property. The porters suffered worst of all. They were seized from villages along the route and made to carry crushing loads through the heat, watched by armed guards. Those who collapsed were not nursed back to strength. Witnesses later described porters executed where they fell, and women and children taken as the column's property. The expedition did not just pass through the land, it consumed it. The violence grew worse with every week of the march. On January 8, 1899, at a town called Sarraounia, the column massacred 101 people. 30 of them were women and children. Officers who objected were silenced or transferred. One lieutenant who wrote home describing the horrors was dismissed from the column. His letters would later reach Paris and light a fire under the government. But that fire burned slowly, and Africa was far away. Word of the column raced ahead of it, carried by refugees, traders, and terrified survivors. The stories said the French column did not fight wars. It erased places. Chiefs and kings along the route faced a brutal choice: fight and be destroyed, or kneel and be robbed. One by one, they knelt. They sent gifts, guides, and grain. They opened their gates and prayed the storm would pass through quickly. By the spring of 1899, the column had carved a corridor of submission hundreds of kilometers long. Voulet-Chanoine had stopped sending honest reports to their superiors. They ruled the column like warlords, executing porters who collapsed, punishing doubt like treason. The expedition that left Dakar as an army of the French Republic was becoming something else, something with no law but its commander's mood. Then it reached the edge of Sarraounia's land. She knew exactly what was coming. Her scouts had tracked the smoke on the horizon for days. Refugees had reached Lougou with stories of what happened to villages that resisted, and just as important, what happened to villages that surrendered. Submission brought no safety, it only brought a slower ruin. The kings around her had already made their choice. Everyone waited to see what the Queen of Lougou would do. Some traditions say she sent the French a message of open defiance, daring them to come and test her. Whether or not the message was real, her actions spoke clearly enough. She would not send gifts. She would not open her gates. She would not kneel. Alone among the rulers in the column's path, Sarraounia chose to fight. That decision changed everything. Her council must have known the numbers. The French had rifles that could kill at a distance no bow could answer. They had a cannon that could break any wall in the Sahel. They had crushed kingdoms far larger than Lougou. Against all of that, Sarraounia had archers, spearmen, and horsemen. On paper, the fight was over before it began. But wars are not fought on paper. She had no intention of fighting the battle the French wanted. She would not stand her warriors in neat lines in the open to be mowed down. She would not lock her people behind walls to be shelled. What she had was the land itself. South of Lougou lay a wilderness of thorn and scrub, so dense that colonial officers would later call it impenetrable. To Sarraounia, it was not a wall, it was a weapon. In the days before the battle, she emptied her capital. The elderly, the mothers, the children, the grain stores, the herds, all of it vanished into the bush, along paths only her people knew. There would be nothing for the invaders to eat, nothing to loot, and no hostages to bargain with. When the column arrived, it would find only what she wanted it to find: warriors, on ground of her choosing. On the morning of April 16, 1899, the French column came within sight of Lougou. The commanders expected another short, one-sided fight, the kind they had won a dozen times on this march. The scouts moved forward through the grass. The riflemen formed up, and then the grass itself seemed to come alive, and arrows began to fall. The French answered the way they always did. The riflemen poured fire into the thickets. The cannon was wheeled up and began to pound the town. Smoke rolled over the walls of Lougou. On every other battlefield of this march, that had been enough to end the fight in minutes. Here, the arrows kept coming. Sarraounia's archers were dug into ground they had known since childhood. They fired from cover, from angles the French could not see, and they did not stay to be found. Volley after volley of rifle fire tore into the bush and hit nothing. The archers struck and moved, struck and moved. Men fell. The advance slowed to a crawl. The Battle of Lougou became the hardest fight of the entire expedition. The column took the town the only way it could, by paying for every meter in blood and ammunition under a burning sun. These were soldiers who had crossed half of Africa while barely losing a man in open battle. In front of this small fortress town, against a queen with no rifles, they were suffering their worst day of the war. When the guns finally fell silent, the count came in. 4 soldiers dead, 6 more wounded. On paper, it may not sound like much. For this column, it was without equal. No army, no city, no king on the entire march had done them this much harm, and the worst part was only now becoming clear to the men standing in the captured town. Lougou was empty. Empty houses, empty granaries, empty shrines. No queen to capture, no treasury to seize, no crowd to make an example of. The greatest weapon of the column was terror, and terror needs an audience. Sarraounia had taken the audience with her. Voulet ordered the town burned, but even that was hollow. You cannot starve people who took the harvest with them. The queen had lost her capital, and it barely mattered. Her fighters pulled back to a second village called Tongana, and when that could no longer be held, they melted into the deep bush, where cavalry could not ride, and the cannon was just a heavy thing to drag. The French had won the ground. They had not won the war, and the war Sarraounia fought next was one they had no answer for. Night after night, her fighters came out of the tall grass. They struck at sentries, cut at the column's edges, stole sleep and confidence, and vanished before the rifles could answer. Every rustle in the dark became a threat. Every shadow at the edge of the firelight might carry a bow. The column had faced armies before and broken them in an afternoon. It had never faced an enemy that refused to be found. Patrols were sent into the bush to finish her, and the bush swallowed them. They came back with empty hands, or short a man, or not at all. The hunters had become the hunted, and every soldier in the column knew it. Some began to say out loud what others only thought. This place did not want them in it. Then the fear took on a name. The African riflemen in the French ranks, many of them dragged into service far from their own homes, began to whisper about the Queen of Lougou. She was a sorceress, they said. She could call fog out of the ground to hide her warriors. Fire leapt from her hands. The footprints of her fighters faded from the earth behind them, so no trail could ever lead to her camp. Some whispered that the burned fields around Lougou had grown back overnight, that her spirits fed her people while the column went hungry. We cannot know which of those stories the soldiers truly believed. We know what the fear did to them. Men woke screaming in the night. Men slipped away into the dark and deserted rather than face her country again. Her legend had become a weapon as real as any arrow, and it was cutting the column from the inside. Voulet could burn any village in Africa, but he could not burn the bush itself, and he could not shoot a rumor. Every day spent hunting one defiant queen cost him men, time, and authority, and gave him nothing back. So the most brutal expedition France ever sent across Africa made a quiet decision. It gave up, the column turned, and marched east, leaving Lougou unconquered at its back. Understand what that means. Kings had knelt to this army. Walled cities had opened their gates to it. One woman, leading one of the smallest nations in its path, fought it, survived it, and watched it walk away. If the story ended here, it would already be one of the great forgotten stands of African history. But it does not end here, because what happened to that column next is the reason her people still speak of a curse. 3 weeks after Lougou, the column reached a great Hausa city called Birni-Nkoni. More than 10,000 people lived within its walls. In early May 1899, Voulet's men destroyed it. Accounts speak of the city wiped out in a single day, of thousands dead, of the wells choked with bodies. It stands among the worst massacres in the entire history of French colonialism. It was also the crime that finally could not be hidden. The dismissed lieutenant's letters had reached Paris at last, and now new reports confirmed them. Politicians, who had happily ignored burned villages, could not ignore a destroyed city and a column that no longer answered to anyone. The government needed the scandal to end quietly, so it turned to one of the most respected officers in the region, Lieutenant Colonel Klobb, and gave him a simple order: find the column, take command, arrest Voulet-Chanoine. Klobb rode after them for more than 2,000 kilometers. The trail was not hard to follow. It was marked in ash. In his notes, he recorded what he found along the way: ruined villages, poisoned wells, fields of bones. At Birni-Nkoni, he wrote of young girls hanged from the branches of trees and more than 1,000 bodies rotting in the sun. The deeper he rode, the clearer the truth became. The men he was chasing were no longer soldiers of France in any way that mattered. As Klobb closed the distance, messages passed between the two forces. Voulet learned who was coming and what he was coming to do. He sent word ahead, warning the colonel to turn back, telling him plainly that he would not give up his command. Klobb read the warnings and kept riding. He had served the flag for decades. He could not believe a fellow French officer would raise arms against it. But victory over distance is not victory over men. He caught up with them in the middle of July 1899 at a place called Dankori. Some records place it on July 14th, the national holiday of France itself. What happened there is where this story began. Klobb approached calmly, in full uniform, trusting that law and rank would protect him. He ordered his own escort not to shoot at fellow soldiers of France. Voulet ordered his men to open fire. The colonel fell dead in the grass, and the last thread connecting the column to the Republic snapped. That evening, Voulet stood before his troops and said out loud what he had become. He declared that he was no longer a French officer. He spoke of marching on, of carving out an empire of his own in the heart of Africa, with these rifles and these men. He had led his column beyond the edge of the law. Now he announced that, for them, the law no longer existed at all. But his soldiers had seen something their commander had missed. They had seen a French colonel die like any other man. The spell of untouchable authority was broken, and it did not break in Voulet's favor. On July 16th, the riflemen mutinied and shot Captain Chanoine dead. The next morning, when Voulet tried to walk back into the camp he had lost, a sentry raised his rifle and fired. The commander of the expedition died in the dirt, killed by his own army. 3 months. That is the distance between the morning Voulet attacked Sarraounia and the morning his own sentry shot him down. In that short season, every officer who had led the assault on Lougou was gone, each one destroyed by the machine he commanded. The Azna heard the news and were not surprised. To them, this was never a mutiny. It was the Queen's curse, arriving exactly on time. You might expect that France punished someone for all of this. It did not. The surviving officers agreed on a tidy version of events that pushed the blame downward onto African soldiers and translators. Several of them were quickly executed, scapegoats for crimes their commanders had ordered. The dead captains themselves were explained away with an invented disease. The African sun, it was said, had cooked their minds. The doctors even gave it a name, acute Sudanite. There was no trial. A demand for a formal inquiry died quietly in December 1900, smothered by good news, because by then the mission had reached its goal. The columns had met near Lake Chad, the last great enemy in the region had been defeated, and the new territory was safely French. The junior officers who inherited the column finished the conquest and later rose to become generals. The empire kept the land, the dead kept their silence. The files were closed, and Sarraounia, the French never captured her. They never signed a treaty with her, never paraded her in chains, never even confirmed her death. The colonial records simply lose track of the queen who beat them, as if the story was too uncomfortable to finish writing. Documented history says only this: she disappeared. Her own people tell the rest. The elders of the Azna say that after her last battle, the queen shut herself inside her palace and stayed there for days while her people kept watch outside. Then, one morning, the doors burst open. No woman walked out. A panther did. It crossed the courtyard in the sight of everyone, slipped into the bush she had defended with her life, and was gone. You do not need to believe in panther queens to understand what that story means. Her people were saying that she was never taken, never broken, never truly gone. The empire could paint her land whatever color it liked on its maps. It could not write an ending to her. She had walked out of history and into something the empire could not conquer: memory. For most of the next century, that memory survived in one place only: the voices of the Azna themselves. Colonial textbooks did not mention her. French school children learned the names of explorers and generals, never the name Lougou. Even in independent Niger, the official story of the nation gave little room to the queen who had fought its conquerors hardest. Scholars would later give this silence a name. 100 years of forgetting. The silence finally cracked in 1980, when a writer from Niger named Abdoulaye Mamani put her name on the cover of a novel, The Drama of the Sorceress Queen. Mamani had grown up with her story in the air around him. He wrote it down so it could not be lost again. And his book found its way to a filmmaker with the stubbornness to match its heroine. The director Med Hondo spent 7 years raising $3 million, refusing every compromise, to bring her to the screen. His film, Sarraounia, appeared in 1986, shot with thousands of extras on the plains of Burkina Faso. In 1987, it won the Golden Stallion, the top prize of Africa's greatest film festival. Critics called it a landmark of African cinema. A queen, erased from the textbooks, was suddenly 20 meters tall, projected onto screens across a continent. In Niger today, her name is everywhere the old records refuse to put it. It marks schools and radio stations, streets and businesses, and in Lougou itself, the line she belonged to never actually ended. Researchers who traveled there found the Azna still keeping a Sarraounia, generation after generation, and still speaking of Mangou as the mistress of all the spirits, the mother of all their traditions. The title survived the empire that tried to erase it. The forgetting was never an accident. The story of the column shamed the colonizer, and the story of the queen embarrassed everyone who claimed Africans had accepted conquest quietly. So both stories were left out of the schoolbooks, in France and in Africa alike. Generations grew up on both continents, never knowing that a woman with archers once outthought an empire. That is what makes the last chapter of this story so remarkable. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one woman. In 2025, the African Union declared a continental year of reparations, and descendants of the communities destroyed by the Voulet expedition took their case to the United Nations. Under that pressure, France signaled, for the first time, that it was willing to sit down and discuss reparations for what its column did in 1899. More than 125 years after the Trail of Ash, the story Sarraounia's people kept alive around their fires is finally being spoken about out loud, in Paris itself. She never signed a treaty. She never rode in triumph through a conquered capital. Measured in territory, she did not win, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The conquest rolled on without her surrender, and the map turned French all around her homeland. But measure her another way. Every ruler in the column's path knelt, and she refused. The men who attacked her were dead within 3 months, destroyed by their own cruelty. Their names are remembered with disgust. Hers is remembered with pride. Think of everything that had to fail for you to have never heard her name until today. The reports were rewritten. The inquiry was buried. The textbooks looked away for a century. And still the story survived, because a people without printing presses or film studios refused to stop telling it. Every empire can silence a document. No empire has ever silenced a grandmother by a fire. That is why this story still matters. Empires, all of them, depend on a simple belief that resistance is pointless, that the strong cannot be told no. Sarraounia proves that belief false. One small nation, led by one determined woman, refused the most terrifying force on its continent, outlasted it, and outlived it. Stories like hers were buried precisely because they are dangerous to that belief. Digging them up is how the forgotten take their power back. The Azna kept her memory alive around their fires for 100 years, waiting for the rest of the world to listen. If this story reached you, help it travel further. Share her name. Tell us in the comments which forgotten African story we should uncover next, and subscribe, because the archives are full of names they hoped you would never hear.